ABC's George Stephanopoulos cut off or ended a conversation abruptly with Ohio Senator JD Vance live on air after he suggested former President Donald Trump could defy the Supreme Court.
The Constitution says that the Supreme Court can make rulings, but if the Supreme Court, and look, I hope that they would not do this, but if the Supreme Court said the President of the United States can't fire a general, that would be an illegitimate ruling, and the President has to have Article II prerogative under the Constitution to actually run the military as he sees fit. This is just basic constitutional legitimacy. You're talking about a hypothetical where the Supreme Court tries to run the military. I don't think that's going to happen, George. But of course, if it did, the President would have to respond to it. There are multiple examples throughout American history of the President doing just that.
You didn't say military in your answer, and you've made it very clear you believe the president can defy the Supreme Court. Senator, thanks for your time this morning.
No, George.
Roundtable's up next. We'll be right back.
The former president recently weighed in on Joe Biden's administration, saying we could be headed toward World War III.
I think this. Our country's a mess. Our borders are open and insecure. 9 months is a long time. You have a very good chance in that period of time of having World War III because we have somebody that is not doing his job properly. He's not respected. He's laughed at all over the world. He's not doing a good job.
He also teased potential vice presidential candidates if he were to win the 2024 presidential election.
Who is your running mate?
Well, I have a lot of good people. We have a lot of really good people.
So you haven't decided who it is?
I have a lot of good ideas, but I haven't. And there's no reason to do that quickly.
So you haven't told that person, you're my person?
I speak to everybody. I called Tim Scott this because a lot of people like Tim Scott. I called him and I said, you're a much better candidate for me than you are for yourself. When I watched him, he was fine. He was good, but he was very low-key, et cetera, et cetera. I watched him in the last week defending me and sticking up for me and fighting for me. I said, you're a much better person for me than you are for yourself, because for himself.
Trump also emphasized the importance in protecting Israel.
The oil.
Would you still send aid to Israel right now?
Look, we've always got to protect Israel, in my opinion. They've been, they're amazing people. What they've done it's an amazing thing, and they've been loyal to us.
Right. So a couple of things there. I guess we should start with the JD Vance up top. Trump is being charged with, by Democrats, not respecting democracy, and Democrats are arguing that the stakes of this election are protecting our most basic institutions. I do think when you have supporters, when you have members in your party out there saying things like the President of the United States doesn't have to respect Supreme Court judgments, it doesn't help your argument that you respect the basic kind of status quo of American democracy. That's not a substantive judgment on what anybody means, but people like JD Vance coming out time and time again with these kind of statements is simply not helping the case that Trump is trying to make, which is that, hey, you can trust me with the reins again.
Well, look, I wish all members of Congress in both parties would loudly articulate that the president is limited in his authority and should not be able to do whatever he wants and should not defy the Supreme Court. I think it was a little, J.D. Vance brought up a theoretical example of the Supreme Court doing something really beyond the pale and unconscionable, whereby people would want the president to actually ignore him. That's not really what's being discussed here, but he brought up a theoretical example, and then, I don't know, it felt like George Stephanopoulos then put a sentence in his mouth and immediately rapped to stop him from responding, which was not fair.
Well, for context, they were talking about an interview that Vance had done back in 2021. This is reporting from Newsweek, where Vance had urged Trump to fire every civil servant in the administration and replace them during a second term, while seemingly suggesting he ignore any Supreme Court ruling that ordered him to stop. So when Stephanopoulos says, well, you didn't, we weren't talking about the Supreme Court overreaching into the president's authority over the military. That wasn't the example we were talking about. That's what he's referencing, that he's now trying to narrow the argument to make it seem more plausible and less outrageous than a clear rejection of the separation of powers, which I think is a fair read of the statements that he made on that podcast back in 2021. Now, J.D. Vance can change his mind, but again, you have folks in your cohort saying things like, hey, when you get a second term, fire everybody, do whatever you want, ignore the Supreme Court, that's where people are getting the impression that Trump doesn't respect democracy. When Trump says, I'm going to be a dictator on day one, and keeps saying it over and over again, even when his ostensible allies on Fox News, like Sean Hannity, try to push him into a more easily digestible answer, like tolerable answer, that is where you get this narrative forming. So you have to place some of the blame, in my view, on Donald Trump and his surrogates' own behaviors here. Well,
Trump and Vance and other Republicans should commit to respecting Supreme Court decisions we do not want to delegitimize the Supreme Court as an institution on the conservative side. However, civil service reform, eliminating some of the bloat in the administrative state, an administrative state that many conservative voters feel has been weaponized against them, is a goal, is something Trump is running on, and it's not, that itself is not some kind of violation of the democratic processes. That is a goal, is to reduce the number of government employees, federal employees. That is what Trump is running on. If he wins, he will try to do that. That will be democracy. That's the platform, and then they're going to implement it. Of course, it should be implemented consistent with the law. It should not, if the Supreme Court halts some aspect of it as illegal or unconstitutional, that should be respected. They should commit to respecting it. But their pitch to voters is that they are going to, and I hope they succeed, and I don't think they did a good enough job of it last time in winding down the administrative state.
Now, on the Trump interview, this is perhaps one of the few times a reporter has gotten him in a one-on-one and been able to press him at all on how he would handle Israel-Gaza any differently than Biden, if at all. And this answer that, quote, we've always got to protect Israel, in my opinion, doesn't seem to suggest there'd be much in the way of difference, at least when it comes to funding and diplomatic cover.
Yes, and that should not actually be surprising, because with foreign policy, we learn that no matter what the voters want, and even if we have a change in direction in the country in terms of what party's in charge, and no matter how much voters indicate that they want a less hawkish foreign policy and that they want American political figures to concentrate on problems at home, there's a tremendous continuity in American foreign policy, always in favor of more intervention and more money being sent overseas. All that said, that was a quick answer. That was like 13 seconds. She asked, would you support, I think her wording was more aid to Israel. Remember, they're going to vote on a standalone additional bill to fund Israel beyond the support we're already giving them. And Trump did not specifically say he might very well support that, but he said, he had a vaguer statement that we must always defend Israel, support Israel, good things about them. So maybe that means the baseline level of funding they're already getting is sufficient. Maybe that means even more funding is necessary. I didn't quite hear him answer that specifically. I wish he would be a little bit more specific about how his foreign policy would be exactly the same or depart significantly from Joe Biden.
I mean, the fact is that he benefits from ambiguity, and yes. I think he understands that.
Yes.
So any non-answers, I think, fall in the column of the implication is, that it's got to be his mark against Donald Trump. Being a fence sitter when you're in a highly charged political environment where people are looking to the president in the presidential election as one of the few opportunities they have to really weigh in directly on America's foreign policy, to give a wishy-washy answer, I think it's got to be a demerit. People should be able to place a vote that is informed. And they fundamentally cannot do that if the candidate themselves won't be honest about what their position is. And say what you want to say. There's no ambiguity about where RFK Jr. stands on Israel. There's no ambiguity about where Biden stands on Israel, even though there are all these articles coming out now that suggest that he is uncomfortable with Bibi Netanyahu. His actual policy priorities, his funding priorities haven't changed in the least. Nor has the kind of diplomatic cover that's been given to Israel by the UN. So Donald Trump, his day has got to be coming, and if he's only sitting down for interviews with more conservative hosts in this kind of format, then it really is incumbent on them to deliver on what their audiences want to know. And their audiences are very much skeptical of continued aid.
Yeah. So he also addressed some VP speculation in that clip, specifically mentioning Tim Scott, saying that Tim Scott has been a very powerful surrogate when speaking in Trump's defense. I'm not sure if we played it in that clip. I can't recall, but he also did mention Kristi Noem. These are, two of the three people that I think are most, in fact, likely to be his VP picks. I'd be, if I was a gambling man, I'd be betting on Tim Scott right now, maybe Kristi Noem.
My hot take is that the way he phrased that, hey, Tim Scott, he works better for me than he did for himself. He had that Trump has this kind of honest way, like you can see his underlying emotions coming out where he's like, hey, I'm kind of surprised this guy's going all out for me because I don't know that I would, this is my read. I'm reading into this, obviously. But what I take from that is he's like shocked and a little confused by how hard Tim Scott is advocating for him because he doesn't see himself reciprocating in any world where the situation were reversed. And that thing that might also suggest that he doesn't feel like he owes Tim Scott anything in return, despite like acknowledging, like, oh, well, this guy's doing anything he wants. I want. He's working really hard for me. Gosh, I wonder why. I think that's my guess.
Yeah, I bet. I think he's picking Scott. I'm feeling Scott right now.
All right.
But we'll see. We'll have plenty of time to speculate wildly. More Rising right after this.